I am Shankar Kumar. I teach history at Hindu College in Delhi University, and welcome to this series on European history. And today we shall be talking about the scientific revolution. And those of you who are from history background would understand that the timeline that I am referring to by and large corresponds to what was also the phase of absolutist state in Europe. It also is coterminous with the Enlightenment period of Europe. So, essentially we are talking of the 17th century, or to be more precise, middle of the 17th century to the middle of the 18th century. And you would see on your slide now the century preceding the Industrial Revolution is in real sense that's the century that we are referring to. Now, at a very general level, we understand that there was something that was happening around this time which drastically transformed the intellectual climate of Europe. And since most of the European countries were the ones who went on to become imperial powers in other parts of the globe, so this changed intellectual climate also was permeated to other parts of the globe, and that is how one section of historians would argue that scientificity or a new paradigm of looking at things began the world over, and Europe being at the center of it. Of course, there can be divergent viewpoints on this count, because scientificity is something which is a generic term, and several other civilizations, for example, Indian civilization itself or Chinese civilization itself, who had long lineage of civilizational history, would argue to the contrary, that there were quite a few elements of scientificity and inquiry and critical assessment or rationality which by and large defines scientific spirit that was there, very much present in their civilizational matrix as well. Nevertheless, this particular lecture is essentially about what was happening in Europe at around the time that we just spoke of, the century preceding the Industrial Revolution. As you can see on the slide, the root word for science is scientia, which is a Latin word, and that refers to knowledge in general. But since we are talking of science or scientific revolution as such, there is a particular procedure with which this knowledge is acquired, and that is what earns the epithet of science for it, because there can be several other ways of acquiring knowledge, and that certainly was not science. But this particular lecture is more about history of science, or you can say permeation of this new way of looking at things and so forth in Europe. And therefore, you would understand that or for that matter, even in day to day parlance, we tend to use or interchangeably use these words. We don't quite make much of a difference between what we understand by pure sciences and the application part of it, that is technology. Most of the ministries the world over, you will find science and technology, they are all clubbed into one, but technically they are two different things. And historically also, in terms of the sheer number of instances that science or pure sciences give us, and technological breakthroughs that were attained, their timeline is also a little bit different. So, while the 17th century stands for pure sciences, breakthrough in pure sciences, technology is something which came somewhat later around the Industrial Revolution, or you can say 18th century Europe. So, talking of Europe in precise terms, we find that pure sciences, particularly physics, had been of interest to the philosophers right from the ancient times, and the name under which such inquiries were studied was designated as natural philosophy. And so, natural philosophy was a term under which what we today understand with respect to physics, chemistry or biological sciences, they all were studied as part of natural philosophy. So, there was not that kind of segregation or division or specialization to the extent that we get to see today. So, the element or degree of interdisciplinarity or interpenetration of disciplines which emerged later is something that that was coalesced to begin with, and gradually, of course, some classifications were made with respect to what constitutes physics, what constitutes chemistry and so forth. University chairs were established accordingly, and that is how the history of these pure science disciplines can be traced. Nevertheless, we are not here talking of the history of disciplines as such. We are talking of what is happening around 17th century, around the early part of 18th century as part of scientific breakthrough. So, in historical terms, since we began with the ancient times and we spoke of the natural philosophy under which these inquiries, these aspects of knowledge were acquired. So, this philosophical preoccupation was somewhat replaced in 17th century by a new combination of knowledge acquisition, and that is very important for us to understand. That is observation, experimentation and rationality. So, they constitute the you can say the keystone, the cornerstone of any scientific inquiry, and it is said that by 17th century all these three elements of scientific inquiry, that is observation, experimentation, rationality, and there are several other things, for example, experimentation to be followed by formulation. So, the entire set of scientific procedures and methods, they could get completed by around 17th century, and that is what gave a new dimension to the kind of inquiries that started getting made from around 17th century onwards. So, very broadly trying to define science or scientific inquiry as it emerged in 17th century Europe, we can say that it came to stand for any systematic field of study or body of knowledge that aimed through observation, experimentation and deduction to produce some kind of a reliable explanation of any phenomena with reference to material and physical world. So, what we get to see here, that emphasis is on material and physical world, and if there are other transcendental or spiritual or emotive aspect of knowledge, that is something that was not included as part of the subject matter of scientific inquiry, and that is how science came to be established around 17th century in Europe. Now, it is revolutionary. Why we are talking about it in revolutionary terms? Because it is the entire bouquet of methods, the three that I just outlined. They could now be taken together in any inquiry, and the entire methodology, that is observation, experimentation and formulation, could be developed only by now, and this is something that was critically missing. So, while observation is all right, I am not saying that what Aristotle wrote in terms of his own laws, and he wrote profusely. He was a polymath of sorts, and he writes about medicine, he writes about cosmology, he writes about politics, he writes about sensibilities. So, when he does that, of course, the basis is observation, all right, but that is not quite followed by the other two components of scientific inquiry that came to demonstrate itself in 17th century, but certainly it was not present before, and that is experimentation and formulation. Now, it is this new methodology that revolutionized knowledge, particularly in physics, astronomy, cosmology, and also mathematics in 17th century. This is not to say that inventions and discoveries were not being made in medicinal science and so forth. They certainly were being made, and we would allude to quite a few from that segment as well in the course of our lecture. Now, For a student of history, it's important to understand what historians have spoken about this phenomena, and if you look at the range of writings around this scientific revolution in 17th century Europe, you find that the opinion of historians is by and large divided into two camps, so to say, and there is one set of historians who would regard development of science as an isolated phenomena, whereas the other group rather regards it as a connected phenomena. When we say connected phenomena, the implication is that it is a social byproduct. So, the coordinates of scientific discoveries and inventions or revelations, whatever that was being carried out around 17th century Europe, had social, economic, religious anchorage in the culture of the time, in the society of the time, or you can say that it was some kind of a need based. It could not have happened before, because it was something which was specifically rooted in the historical context of 17th century. Or the other way we can understand it is that there must have been a series of inventions and discoveries, and standing on the shoulder of that, these scientists could come out with their works by around 17th century. So, there is something that they owe to their predecessors. So, in that way it is historically rooted, and that is the opinion of one set of scholars, whereas others regard science as quite autonomous, science as quite isolated, and it can negate historical circumstances, and it is something which is a byproduct of human imagination and human ingenuity, and that can surprise the context in which the person is operating. So, these are the two binaries of opinions that we get to see in the historical writings around the scientific revolution. And we would conclude by saying, and let me reveal it before, that the opinion is still out, and it's inconclusive debate, so to say. Now, the isolationist argument is something which argues that the scientific phenomena or the discoveries and inventions that spans 17th century and early part of 18th century Europe is independent of society, and therefore it should rather be studied in its own right. It should be studied not necessarily with the coordinates of history, geography, or needs, or politics, or culture, and so to say, whereas the other opinion is championed by Charles Webster. He was the first to challenge this isolationist approach towards scientific revolution, and he argued that if one subscribes to isolationist approach, then it eventually limits the subject matter of history, it limits the scope of history, and that is because it does not tend to establish any connection with the social, economic, cultural and economic currents of the period. And eventually he also argues that it even limits the scope of science itself. So, science also becomes very limited in scope if one subscribes to the isolationist approach, and there is no credence given to what happened before or what it could have led to had the circumstances been different, and so forth. In the writings of A.C. Crombie and Claggett, we get to see that there is emphasis on the progressive aspect of science. And when we say progressive aspect of science, this is precisely what we mean, what I was referring to earlier, that you owe something to the entire series of works that have been carried out before, and in their absence perhaps it would not have been possible for the physicists or chemistry persons or biology physicians to come out with the kind of scintillating inventions and discoveries that they did in 17th century. For instance, Galileo and others owe their achievement to a series of ancient and medieval scientists, and therefore science is rooted in past, science is related to past, it cannot happen in vacuum. So, such kinds of changes cannot happen in vacuum. If there is no anteriority to something, it is likely to go in a different way. So, that's the crux of their argument. Now, Marxist historians, particularly if you examine their works, you also find that there is due emphasis that they accord to social dimension of scientific revolution, and this is again in order to highlight the connected aspect of science and science or idea, because Marxists operate with this infrastructure and superstructure paradigm, and there is a limit to which they can give autonomy to ideas, and therefore it has to be rooted in society, it has to be rooted in the economy, in the needs of the times, and that's the impression that we get with respect to scientific discoveries, particularly in the Marxist historians' writings. For example, Boris Hessen, who wrote Social and Economic Roots of Newton's Principles, he links scientific developments with the needs of the bourgeoisie. So, here you find a section of society, a class of society which is emergent, which is emerging as powerful and politically relevant, and this bourgeoisie as a class is supposed to provide leadership, progressive leadership, for another couple of centuries hereafter, situated in 17th century, and he says that it is primarily or scientific discoveries or inventions are primarily catering to the needs of the bourgeoisie. Similarly, if you read Edward Zilsett, there is some kind of a sequential progression of things that he presents. For example, he talks of feudal breakdown leading to breaking of class barriers, and once the class barriers are done away with, there is development of mutual relationship amongst people, and it is this changed reality of the 17th century. This is more open than the moribund feudal society, which is rather compartmentalized, not fostering connections and flow of ideas and so forth. So, it is this changed circumstance in 17th century which leads to some kind of a spurt in the experience of senses and rationalization, and that constitutes the bedrock of scientific inquiry. So, this is how, in a very broad sense, scientific revolution as a phenomena is anchored in the Marxist writings in the society and times of 17th century. Similarly, if we look at Engel's works, he also links scientific developments to social needs, and so does Christopher Hill. And Christopher Hill actually takes the example of Harvey's blood circulation, which was a path-breaking change with respect to medicinal science, because even if you think of Ayurveda, Ayurveda did not quite know that blood flows through the veins and ultimately it is heart that pumps blood into these veins. Otherwise, conceptualizations by ancient civilizations, or for that matter even European civilization, was somewhat different, and Christopher Hill takes the example of Harvey's blood circulation as a noted change in 17th century, as a noted example of 17th century scientific revolution, and he also argues that it is the changed social climate and distinct impact in Harvey's work could be discerned, which reveals the changed circumstances of 17th century, and he explored some linkages which could have led to this. So, by and large, what we see is that one can say that this debate of isolationist versus social or cultural is something which is still not quite conclusive. And since the nature of science itself keeps evolving on account of on account of researches, cutting edge revelations, information, changing paradigms. Therefore, this particular debate in history writing by and large can be said to be inconclusive. Thank you.